The Harris Lecture Series was established in 1946 by a trust from the bequest of India Crago Harris in the name of her husband, Addison Harris, and it brings prominent scholars to our law school every year. Past Harris lecturers include Derrick Bell, Laurence Tribe, Elizabeth Warren, Robert Bork, and Guido Calabresi. Today, it is my honor to introduce Maurer Matsuda, Professor of Law at the William S. Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii. Professor Matsuda holds a BA from Arizona State University, a JD from the University of Hawaii, and an LLM from Harvard Law School. Before beginning her teaching career, she clerked for Judge Herbert Choi of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and worked as an associate in the labor law firm of King Nakamura in Honolulu. She has taught at UCLA and Georgetown, as well as at the University of Hawaii. Professor Matsuda is one of the most prominent and influential voices in critical race theory in the country. Her research investigates the interplay of race, law, and power in areas including affirmative action, employment discrimination, hate speech, and reproductive rights. She is the author of several books, including Where is Your Body? Essays on Race, Gender, and the Law, and Words That Wound, Critical Race Theory, Assault of Speech, and the First Amendment, as well as countless journal articles. In bringing the voice of outsiders to legal discourse, Professor Matsuda has had a profound impact on the legal academy. Her work is frequently cited by judges as well as by scholars and has generated sustained and important debates about law and inequality in our society. Her scholarship on issues of social justice is clearly connected to and informed by her own work as an activist. She serves on the national advisory boards of a number of social justice organizations and is deeply engaged as a volunteer and as a lawyer in her own community. One of the areas in which she is currently working is public education, and she will speak to us today on change and legal education. Please join me in welcoming this year's Harris Lecturer, Professor Maurer Matsuda.
That was a lovely introduction. Do you mind my asking, did you write that? The reason I ask is I do a lot of public speaking, and usually when people introduce you, they go online and find something on Wikipedia. And I could tell that that was original work, and I so appreciate the time that went into that. Thank you very much. And thank you, all of you who turned out today. I know for those of you who are law students, your pressures are many, and your choice to come and listen to a non-required lecture is very, very much appreciated by me as a speaker. Let's start in 1965. Young civil rights workers are registering voters in Lowndes County, Alabama. Their work disrupts a centuries-old bargain between northern and southern elites that has kept the firm grip of Jim Crow throughout the American South. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, called the New Abolitionists by Howard Zinn, have a plan. Their plan is to bring about the promise of the 13th Amendment to eliminate the badges and incidents of slavery. Just as the first Reconstruction met with burning crosses and lynch mobs, so does this second. The Klan was not needed when Jim Crow was firmly in control. My students are reading the opening chapter of Taylor Branch's Canaan's Edge, and it opens with a scene where civil rights workers and worshipers at Sunday service at a tiny, tiny church in rural Alabama. And if you've been to the rural South, you know how you can go on these roads for miles and the trees hang over the roads and you feel like there is no civilization for miles in any direction. And then there's this church in the clearing. And suddenly those gathered in the church realize that some vehicles, trucks and cars have surrounded the church. And this can only mean a promise of violence in this context of the voter registration drive that has been happening, and given the record of recent assaults and murders of civil rights workers. At this point in the reading, one of my students said, "I just thought, oh my God, and they didn't even have cell phones." And she realized how ridiculous this thought was when she followed it with, but who would they have called? Because we knew from our study that in this period the Klan and the police were one, that the federal government in Washington at that very moment was having impassioned debates about whether they should intervene with the growing troubles in the South, and so far the non-interventionists were winning. I looked at my students and I said, I know, I wanted them to have someone to call to. The feeling of desperation that one gets when you see law is needed and law is absent, when there's no one to call to enforce the basic rules that restrain one human being from harming another. That feeling led to a deeper discussion about the rule of law. Why do we need it? Can we use it to solve the deep problems that were faced then and that we face now? What progress did law make in ending racial subordination? We know that those brave new abolitionists did win significant and lasting changes, and that more than a handful of them lost life and limb in that struggle. The crisis brought about by bodies willing to stand in harm's way to claim the right to vote, to end the badges of incidents of slavery, brought forth a great fountain of law. The Voting Rights Acts, Title VII, Title IX. These laws changed everything about my life as a woman of color and a professional. These laws meant that my daughter, at age 14, played basketball, as though that was the natural thing for girls to do, as natural as it was for me at 14 to take sewing, which is what everyone did in my school if you were female and 14. All of these laws, these life-changing, world-changing laws, began with organizers moving down lonely rural roads in rural Alabama, rural Georgia, rural Mississippi, creating a crisis that then created law, temporarily resolving the crisis and setting the stage for the next big one. That's our crisis. And it is shaking our windows and rattling our walls. It is the cruelty of wealth inequality. It is cities swamping climate change. It is students facing school loans that create a lifelong burden. It is hunger. I'd be willing to venture that somewhere in your state and somewhere in mine, a parent is skipping a meal in order to make sure that a child eats. It is that actual hunger, and it is a larger hunger of the soul as we ask one another, is there something about our culture, aside from easy access to guns, that makes mass murder a regular occurrence for us? So regular that the outrage lasts maybe a day or two before we go on to the next subject. If you think everything is just fine, I will take no offense if you leave this lecture now. I begin with the premise that we are in crisis. And I presume that this premise is widely shared. Where we diverge is the next step. What is the way out? And what does law school have to do with it? This lecture was prompted by critics of legal education who have identified some of our practices in law schools as unsustainable and regressive. It is not intended, however, as another entry in the genre of what should we do about the future of law schools. Rather, it's an attempt to expand that conversation by putting law schools in crisis at the tail of a dog with a much bigger problem, and to see how we, as fleas on the tail of a drowning dog, might appropriately respond. The first person to tell me that my future was endangered by climate change was a law professor. This was back in the early 80s. The alarmist statements made by a respected and measured thinker, a property professor, put a big flag in the parking lot of the mine, and since then that parking lot has filled with data and information. And I feel that that erudite gentleman made the mistake of speaking too calmly. He should have been screaming. The planet is now speaking loudly for him as fire, flood, and killer winds come to claim us. I do have friends and relations in the non-fact-based world who still send me climate change denial links, but there is an emerging consensus that we have a world-changing problem on our hands and no agreement, no plan currently in place to avert it. In my home state of Hawaii, the scientists have drawn a map with a line that shows where the water is going to rise to in my children's lifetime. I look at that map and I think about, we have this funny land tenure system in Hawaii where for historical reasons, much of the land is held by a few large landowners. So if you want to buy a house, often you don't buy the land, you lease it. But these are long-term leases. They can be 100 years long, longer than you will use the house. But people don't like to buy under that term. We call it leasehold. And the realtors say, well, you don't want that house. That one's leasehold. You want that good old fee simple absolute. So we can see the long view when it comes to land tenure, a concept that we're familiar with. But when it comes to climate change and the fact that half our island's going to be underwater, including all the luxury property in Waikiki, that's too hard to think about. So we do what teenagers and toddlers do. We refuse to think about it. What we don't like will go away. And if you try to tell me otherwise, you're making a big problem for me, and you should go away. This is magical thinking. And you can't run a planet with that kind of brain. We need grown-ups. And law school might have a contribution to make here. In addition to climate change, there are two looming intertwined threats to our well-being that we should feel grabbing at our throats. And that is increasing wealth inequality domestically and internationally, and global violence. If you see climate change as a precursor to scarcity and therefore to violence, then we can call these three reinforcing triplets: inequality, unsustainability, war. There are local and global permutations of inequality. Those sounding the law school alarm talk about the fact that some of our graduates are still getting six-figure jobs and some of our graduates are getting no job. This version of wealth equality is our responsibility and therefore not to be ignored, but it does seem petty in comparison to the bleeding hands of people who pick our food and live without running water and working toilets. And that kind of grinding poverty seems petty in comparison with the active violence and torture faced by our global neighbors living in war zones. In the hour that passes as we sit in this clean, well-lit room, assured of the fact that we will have breakfast tomorrow, more than one child will die from poverty, from violence, from malnutrition, from preventable disease. Whatever religious, political, or moral tradition you come from, you and I share the horror of this knowledge. And that is a starting point. We are human beings with the gift and responsibility of knowledge. That's the curse of modernity. We can see beyond the horizon and know what happens to a Syrian refugee, a Chinese factory worker, a Brazilian favela dweller. We can see how choices we make in our village interact with lives elsewhere, and we can speculate that dislocations elsewhere might erupt in ways that disrupt our peace. Things do not fall out of the sky on us like an asteroid fell on the dinosaurs. Whether climate change, war, or asteroid, we have knowledge, and we can prepare. My plea for law schools is, let's prepare. Let's train our students to make things better. The huge task falls to us because lawyers, at their best, are leaders and professional problem solvers. They gather facts, they assess them critically, they deliberate, strategize, and construct paths to better outcomes. They do this for clients, they do this for nations, and in my utopian vision, they will do this for our planet. If you visit your state legislature, or mine, or our Congress, you will see a range of capabilities. Some lawmakers work very hard at crafting legislation. They read what they sign. They consider competing arguments. They attempt to think about unanticipated consequences, the history of prior consequences, and the multiple influences that predict future outcomes. Some lawmakers do none of that. If you spend any time around the process of law production, you will meet the joker and the thief, those who lack minimal attributes of intelligence and work ethic required for the public trust, and who never ask, what's good for my country? I was shocked when I moved to Washington, D.C. and attended my first congressional hearings at the level of the discourse. I knew that I would disagree with much of the content. I'm a social critic, and I expected that. But I thought that in the halls of Congress, people would at least try to appear intelligent, deliberative, thoughtful. C-SPAN was in its early days, so the lack of intellectual rigor in the lawmaking conversation was news to some of us. As a citizen, I expected more, and as the years progressed, I got less. The old statescrafters of both parties, for whom persuasive oratory, marshaling evidence, steely-eyed negotiation were required skills, say that's over. Well, we can and we should demand intelligent public deliberation, preceding decisions as momentous as going to war or defunding the government. A general public disgust with Congress is not limited to party affiliation, and the hunger for intelligent leadership is palpable amongst us. The support for an improbable candidate, the then President Obama in his first presidential run, reflected, I believe, the longing for this. Maybe this outsider, this law professor, this erudite orator, this high IQ book reader who radiates reasonableness is whom we need to get us out of Washington gridlock. Whatever you think about how that hope played out, you might agree that at that moment, the hope and the yearning for a better form of leadership among so many, particularly young people, was real. I will publicly disagree with the president On the law school question, 3 years is barely enough. 2 would shortchange our students, and 4 would not be unreasonable. More on this later. But let's start by asking what a lawyer is and what we mean when we say lawyer. We could mean scrivener, someone who knows the language and craft of legal materials and can recite and deploy them with proficiency. On the day I became an official state-sanctioned lawyer, I raised my hand and took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution and laws of the United States of America. My students know me as a social critic, and I say, I did not have the other hand crossed-fingered behind my back. I take seriously constitutionalism and my obligations as both a professional and a citizen. The Constitution is a living document, and it needs our deep commitment to democracy in a changing and challenging world to protect and defend it. The lawyer's pledge is to keep this commitment when it is easy and when it is hard, never joining the hopeless sinners who would harm all mankind just to save their own. When I was still a law student, a partner from a fancy law firm came to talk to all of us and said, law is a profession. If you're here because you want to make money, go sell insurance. I guess that's how you made money then. I'm not sure if it is now. This was the standard insider's line. We are granted a monopoly on the right to practice law, and if pressed, that lawyer holding the traditional view would have said something about high ethical standards, providing pro bono services to those who can't afford it, and possessing a life of the mind. We are thinkers, not just technicians. When I arrived downtown as a young lawyer, most of the old-timers could quote literature from heart. They collected art. They discussed international affairs with insider asides. And they subscribed to magazines that didn't bother to translate common Latin or French phrases. When you hung out with these guys, and they were almost all guys, you felt smart. In whatever province, however far from the metropole, that's what lawyers sounded like, with a local accent. And I know there were many among the alums of this law school. I wrote a biography of one, Harriet Bauslag, a small-town Hoosier who was a world-changing firebrand. How many current students know about Harriet Bauslag and In re Bauslag Supreme Court case? Oh, go read it. She was disbarred by the state of Hawaii because she said, during the height of McCarthyism, a labor leader cannot get a fair trial in this state. And that was called impugning the integrity of the judiciary. She called it free speech, and the Supreme Court of the United States agreed with her. Let us not overly praise great men. I'm talking about the traditional lawyer who was basically the person in charge when I started practicing. This traditional lawyer, as town's elite, often perpetuated privilege, worked to entrench systems that were not healthy. But such men also, on occasion, used their position to stand up forthrightly for the right and the good when silence and acquiescence from other quarters ran thick. Think of Charles Evan Hughes, lawyer to the New York Scions, who led a game-changing anti-corruption campaign in New York City. Garner Anthony, lawyer to sugar barons in Honolulu, fought martial law during World War II as unconstitutional in its denial of habeas corpus. The tradition of straight-up corporate lawyers whose day job was helping the rich stay rich, taking up lonely cudgels to uphold the rule of law simply because it was the right thing to do, and they had the status and the brains and the means to do it. This is a professional legacy of the title lawyer. Indeed, as the war on terror brings us profligate government surveillance and threats to habeas corpus, I await the contemporary equivalent of those earlier crusaders. These are ABA issues, not just ACLU issues. And the contemporary equivalent of the top hat and tails crowd should bellow forth outrage at the diminishment of core constitutional values, and they should litigate like lions challenged in their own den. The fact that no such prominent crusader emerges immediately to mind tells us something about the triumph of market-driven technocrat Barr. It is no longer accomplishment, prestige, erudite learning, power. It's eat what you kill, and partners in the grand old firms tell me it's really not fun anymore. They don't want their children doing their work. I just talked to an alum, now retired, of this law school who told me his son-in-law quit practicing, and it's a good thing too. We need to do something about our profession to bring back that sense of urgency that what we do matters. Given the crisis, which threatens the survival of capitalism as well as the well-being of the collective and the physical survival of the planet, we need to revive the notion of lawyer as professional problem solver, social critic, leader, and thinker. The person you call when a problem is big. In my locked heart, I keep an actual list of people I would call in a true crisis. You pick the bad movie plot: a kidnapped child, a false accusation of a crime, or the one that stays in my mind because most of my life occurred in the last century, a knock on the door because of something you wrote or something you said, and the fascists are coming to disappear you. My, in case of emergency call, list consists mostly of lawyers. Not because these are my only friends, but because they have the skill set needed to confront really big problems. A short list of people who are extremely smart, deeply charming, viciously tenacious, infallibly loyal, wickedly strategic, and widely experienced is who I'd call. I've seen them take on giants and win with glee. In my more mundane and actual life, I've had to call lawyers around those classic small issues: divorce, wills, a neighbor's complaint about an encroaching fence. And in each of those cases, a problem that I had that was big to me but small to the universe got dropped in someone else's lap, and they took care of it. I wish that all my problems were legal problems. It was so easy and so full of grace, that moment when the lawyer looked me in the eye and said, "It's gonna be just fine. Here's what I'm gonna do. It's my problem now." From thinking about that small grace of paying a competent professional to solve my problems, and the large grace of knowing a lawyer to call when one's life is on the line, from there, let's ratchet up to the biggest problem of all: surviving on our irreversibly globalized planet. Every person in the less developed world wants a car and a refrigerator in their dreams. Well, they can't all have a car and a refrigerator without sending us into climate oblivion. But who are we, with our 2 cars and in many cases 2 refrigerators, to tell them they can have none? And that's just one simple matrix of a very complicated problem. The threats we face do not stay within our borders, and yet we have no mechanism to create global solutions to global problems. There is a model that has worked, sometimes weakly, but for over 200 years. And it is the American constitutional experiment, including federalism, democracy, and the rule of law. We are the most diverse nation on the planet, encompassing a concordance of race, religion, culture, worldview, belief, and practice more radically divergent than any polity that has heretofore risen to ascendancy in the history of humankind. We are the proof that people as different as night and day can commit to one set of governing processes and follow them with big bloody detours to create a semblance of stability and prosperity. I, an aggressive critic of the times we have gotten it wrong, am also deeply grateful for the blessings that I and my family have reaped from what we have gotten right. The general belief that there are too many lawyers, too many laws, too much litigation, the American exceptionalism as an overly legalized life, fails to understand that law came from human hand, human will, and human desire. This is the insight I learned from scholars like Lawrence Friedman, Willard Hurst, and even Oliver Wendell Holmes. Excess law did not fall on us as victims of a lawyer's full employment conspiracy. We have legalism because people desired it. It is a much better option than the alternatives of private violence, and it is really our only option if we don't want to cede decision-making to a benign dictator who does not exist. I once set out to study the legal history of the early use of the legal system by Native Hawaiians in what anthropologists call first contact period, when Western colonization first began in Hawaii. And my starting hypothesis was that these bewildered natives would be confused and exploited by this new system that was thrust upon them. Instead, what I found was an active and aggressive embrace of law and courts by a newly litigious people whose the norms and enforcements that they'd followed for hundreds of years were disrupted and horribly destroyed by the death, really. I'm talking about literal death. So many Native people were decimated in the years of first contact, that their system of making things work so that people could live together in peace no longer existed. And they turned anxiously to the courts. Law is a tool. People choose it when they need it. It was our nation's instrument of development, the commons at which we gathered to decide who we would be. From Plessy to Brown, from Marbury to Bush versus Gore, our drama of nation-making took place on a legal stage because we had no shared stage of belief, culture, or creed. You don't need law if everyone is following the same social code, and if it's fear of the gods that's keeping you from fishing out of season. But if we don't share that belief and social code, and certainly on this planet there is no one set, then law is what you got as a means that will link us to mutual modes of dispute resolution and problem solving. Like double entry bookkeeping, law arose with capitalism when merchants left their own village. If you live in one village and you cheat someone, you're dead socially. But once we can travel and you're dealing with strangers, you need new ways of preventing cheating, of enforcing norms so that trade can expand. We can fast forward, and that's how you get the UCC. I teach torts, and the students hate torts because in torts, it's common law, and it's different in every state, so you have to learn, well, here they do this, here they do that, majority view, minority view, and it might change tomorrow, so shepherdize everything. Commercial law, at least sales and things like that, are incredibly stable because business needs it stable. So it's the same rule in every state except for Louisiana, and even they're coming closer to the norms all the time because they don't have any choice. They want to make money just like everybody else. All right, so Marx calls this law arising from human needs superstructure. It's an ideological product that reflects the material base of economic relations. And he doesn't discount the power of it just because it's ideological and superstructural, but he wants us to look at the base, and he had the core of what most people think of Marx is this critique of the base, the way labor is exploited and alienated at that level. I agree with Marx on the critique. I agree that law is superstructural. Where I diverge is my emphasis on a corollary insight. Law is superstructural, and it can create significant humanizing effects. It's a location of important struggle, just as the factory is a location of struggle in the material world. The ideological contradictions can resolve in ways that are important for the least advantaged members of our community. In non-theoretical language, what happens in legal fights matters and can make a big difference in all of our lives. In a world without unifying norms, we will use law to solve our crisis, or we're left to guns. And since guns now include weapons of mass destruction, that is not a path I suggest we follow. We need lawyers, and good ones, who can think critically to solve problems, creating legal structures that will allow human beings to grow and thrive together. At best, the ability to understand and create these structures will come with an ability to deploy them strategically and promote them to convince others that they're a good idea. That is, a good lawyer doesn't just design a better mousetrap. A good lawyer has to understand the political and social world to get everyone on board to use the new mousetrap enthusiastically before bubonic plague takes over. Now, I use the plague metaphor deliberately because public health crises is an example of that kind of boundary-crossing crisis that will need lawyers to solve. I'm talking about things like HIV and bird flu and resistant TB that start in places where there's poverty, illiteracy, absence of health care. And if we think of that as not our problem, there's going to be an emergency room doctor here that has to deal with that problem that we thought was not our problem. Okay, the doctors and the epidemiologists are telling us, think about this, but it's going to be lawyers, globally adept border-crossing lawyers that figure out how we get international cooperation and enforcement mechanisms to deal with the next plague. Some of my best students will never practice law in the traditional sense, and many of the alums that I look at. They go straight into community building, organizational, and transactional work aimed at precisely the kind of problem solving I am begging for. One who put on a play in law school, an Anna DeVere Smith play, is now traveling up and down the Latin American continent doing human rights work. One who talked her way into locked housing projects in Washington, D.C., doing tenant work, is now organizing undocumented youth in New York City, including really interesting web organizing. One who mentored in high poverty schools is now running a women's walk-in self-help center in Louisville. I know of students running big public health, former students, public health programs, immigrant worker centers, medical legal partnerships, grants making programs, i.e. handing out money to people to do good things, environmental advocacy groups, change-making arts and education programs of all kinds. I once taught an experimental course in anti-subordination theory, and it was an experimental elective, everyone who signed up for it was either a woman, a person of color, a woman of color, for one white male who sat quietly on the side all semester and barely said a word. And I sometimes kind of wondered, is he in the right class? Why did he take this class? Southern fraternity man. Today, 20 years later, he's running a high school in a prison and teaching other people how to do the same. None of these former students who I'm so proud of are doing JD required traditional kinds of practice. And every one of them is using lawyer skills to do vitally important work. They raise the money, work around the regulations, persuade strategic allies, manipulate rules, principles, rhetoric, and law. They hire, train, supervise, and deploy experts, including lawyers. They are change agents and among the best lawyers I know. As our nation debated whether to bomb Syria, one of the strongest arguments was, there's no one else. If there is a serious breach of international law, we, as the strongest military power on the planet, have to respond if no one else will. We are indeed the only ones, if measured by economic and military might, at the top of the heap in our ability to either make problems or solve them. Our actions and inactions are capable of leaving a giant's footprint. And the world needs the giant to act wisely. What could this possibly have to do with a law school in Bloomington or Honolulu, where I teach? Many of our students are destined for local practice. The obvious answer, one, is that in a federal system, states have inordinate power over the giant, as evidenced by current debates over the federal budget. Another answer is that our graduates who form the educated elite of our states are the influencers charged with upholding constitutional values and discerning correct response to crisis on the local level. And their ability to see the connection between the local and the global is part of the web that will make things better or worse. We have to act on climate change now. There will not be a second chance. Local interests, producer states and consumer states alike, are tied to global stakes. Fossil fuel dependency is not a concept, it's a reality with consequences, from local jobs to wars overcoming scarcity that will take sons and daughters from all of us. I have fellow alums of my law school and family in my hometown who have buried their children who served this nation in recent wars. We asked for blood and treasure. Did we ask wisely? Critical thinkers in every town and hamlet have to bring wisdom to the table to answer these questions. If I am right, and lawyers will help to make these choices when lives hang in the balance? The next question is, how do we train them? Excuse me, I'm a feminist. I don't run from emotions. We know that the work is complicated and that parochial approaches are inadequate for solving problems of global proportion. Military strategists talk of the folly of fighting the last war. Legal and public policy strategists similarly have to maintain flexible, creative, multivariate toolkits. A strategic generalist is best positioned to guide us through the future unknown. I do find invaluable the traditional lawyer's skills, critical thinking, manipulation of rhetoric, case analysis, argument from analogy, statutory interpretation, anticipation of counter-arguments. All of us who teach in the first-year curriculum have watched the miracle of students coming in September, making muddy, overgeneralized, marginally relevant, randomly focused arguments, shocked out of that sloppiness by December. As one of my students said in his graduation talk, here's what I learned in law school. The answer is always, it depends. Lawyering skills include, in addition to this rhetorical analysis, the clinical. How do you interview and talk to clients? How do you move a case through its life cycle, including the all-important skills of writing and thinking on your feet and oral advocacy? I could do a whole aside now on just talk to faculty and hear them complain about how nobody can write anymore. We need to push writing skills. I think one of the most important clinical courses I took in law school was negotiation. Not all lawyers litigate or do depositions, that kind of thing. All lawyers need to negotiate and persuade others to come to agreement on courses of operation. Beyond that traditional set of lawyering skills, lawyers also need a radically interdisciplinary toolkit. That doesn't mean that you have to become an expert in computer coding or read the complete works of Dworkin. It does mean knowing how to ask useful questions, how to call in experts to identify knowledge paths that require exploration. A good strategist knows how to assess available resources. What do I know? What do I not know? What do I need to find out? General knowledge is the platform that allows this kind of assessment. A good lawyer knows how to collect and evaluate data, has to have working knowledge of science, technology, the world of power, finance, organizing for social change, foreign policy, and must consider psychology and the complexity of human minds and behavior. One of the pieces that stays with students from a class I teach called Peacemaking is an essay on groupthink that describes the behind-the-scenes conversations during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's scary. And when they read it, my students promise me, it's scary to them because they identify so much with the characters. These are the best and the brightest, after all. And they nearly get us killed. They promise me that when they're sitting in a room someday making decisions of momentous importance, they will seek out and welcome the dissenting view. Whether they get that notion of what deliberations ought to look like from groupthink, from Shakespeare, from Chinwe Achebe, from whatever piece of writing, they need that lifelong hubris killer in their toolkit. And the more power they hope to attain, the more important it is they take that with them. I find many of my students know nothing about political economy. I might allude to an argument as Keynesian, and I'll look in their notes later and see they're spelling it with a C like Cain and Abel. Even economics majors often know little about the epistemological critiques and intellectual history relevant to their field, not to mention never having read Marx, Engels, Hegel, or even Adam Smith in full text. If you read the discussion around future of law schools, you'll see a lot of fuming about the teaching of humanities in the law schools. They make fun of it. Lawn basket weaving is a phrase I saw. This is the elite pastime of overindulged dilettante professors that just teach things that are interesting to them. I'm trying not to be overly defensive because the classes I teach have been named in print by commentators who have looked only at the course titles and have not asked me about the content of what we do in class. These include feminist legal theory, peacemaking, organizing for social change, anti-subordination theory, and practice. I could defend these classes in practical terms. I have seen class action settlements where hundreds of millions of dollars fly off the balance sheet of some corporation because middle managers lacked basic intro work in critical race theory and women's studies. These cases are in the reporters, and you can talk to the CEOs who will say quite frankly that learning before Title VII litigation is quite preferable to learning during and after. The ones at the top know that the kind of intercultural knowledge and deep understanding of the persistence of racism, sexism, and homophobia in our culture that critical theorists grapple with is exactly what they need to know about. Our goals differ, but wide-ranging inquiry into difference and subordination is a shared path. For me, the goal is justice. For them, the goal is risk management, market share, and extracting shareholder value in places radically different from home. They know that closed-minded monoculturals are not good at this. And I guarantee you that somewhere in corporate America, they're hiring anthropologists right now to explore ways that changing attitudes towards gay marriage will open business opportunities. The justification is not bottom line, however. What ultimately defends humanistic, anti-subordination, interdisciplinary teaching at the center of the law school curriculum is, as Stephanie Wildman has argued, justice. She would love that I got my sentence flipped around there. A primary muscle that has atrophied in these recent decades of overwhelmed capitulation to the status quo is the capacity for utopian visioning and justice making. When I ask my students to visualize a just world and the specifics of it, they go silent or mention very small things. Bike paths, big things like free quality childcare on demand, which any feminist in the 1970s could have rolled off in 5 seconds of being asked, what do women want, do not come easily to my students. They hear objections and imagine a kind of an immobilized stance before they can articulate visions. They can critique, they can tell me what the problems are, but when I say, well, what are you going to do about it? They say, me? What about an immediate bailout from student debt as part of the stimulus package, I asked. Well, people would say we signed a contract. GM signed a contract, the bank signed a contract, they got a bailout. I never thought about that. Why shouldn't we pay you to go to law school? Aren't you going to pay us back in future revenue generation? I know that me and my classmates did. I had a subsidized legal education. It was paid for by the taxpayers of my state. And I know that some actuarial economic analysts could go through the career paths of my classmates and show that that was a bargain for the taxpayers. Run the numbers. Education generates revenue. What if we don't see students and taxpayers as separate people? What if we're all one, all benefiting from an investment in education? The biggest economic growth of our lifetimes came from intellectual capital. The places where the new tech-driven economy took off in the 90s clustered around universities. Bill Gates went to a great high school. He was interested in these things called computers. And they said, okay, let's get you a room in some of these machines and you figure out what they are and what you can do with them. They did not say, here's our standardized test, here's our rubric, here's our scripted curriculum, and show up tomorrow for the test. Children and university students and law students, broadly educated and empowered to pursue knowledge on their own engine, are our best chance at future economic growth. My students' small vision changes when we interject a few examples from the wider world. And soon they start outpacing me with the range of their ideas. If some of you have to leave, I won't be offended. I know you have appointments. I'll wrap up soon. We talk about social change organizing, and I have a whole section that I'll put in my printed version that I don't have time for here, where we ask the question, how do you actually change relationship of power so that important ideas like tackling climate change will actually come forth with workable plans? And as we do that, we explore all of social change. I taught the book Berger's Daughter in my organizing class. It's a book that really criticizes everyone on the path to change the world. Berger is someone who sacrificed his own family because he wanted to fight apartheid. But other characters are in complicity with apartheid. And there's a line in the book that talks about their lives. They eat without hunger, they mate without desire. I've memorized that line because every single student in my class circled it and wanted to talk about it the next day, about what happens when you have complicity with subordination. That encounter with literature that's embedded in a social change movement was important to them and to me. And people that make fun of what we do in those classes, I wish they could come and hear the discussion and what it does to making for good lawyers. I'm going to close with a short list of a few things that I would like every lawyer to know, and it's idiosyncratic. Every lawyer should know how to read a financial statement, how to converse in at least one language other than English, how to respond to the basics of anti-subordination theory, including the all-important epistemologic incursions into the fact-value distinction made by feminists and critical race theorists. Every lawyer should understand the basics of finance and how the Federal Reserve Board works, should take a course in negotiations, should memorize at least one poem by heart, and should do work, whether pro bono, straight-up charity, religious proselytizing in prisons, community organizing, structural class action litigation, that gives them a direct contact with the actual lives of their neighbors who are underhoused, underemployed, and underlawyered. Whatever list you follow, doing a good job of it, I suspect, would take more than 2 years. This is exacerbated by the fact that pressures on K through 12 and undergraduate education to respond to market demands means that I encounter fewer students who have had a broad interdisciplinary undergraduate education. I regularly meet students who never, not once, were asked to write an in-depth research paper using primary sources and developing an original thesis, who have never, not once, read an entire book from cover to cover and were expected to discuss and defend their analysis and interpretation of that book. The charge that broadly interdisciplinary legal education is elitist and frivolous and maybe good enough for some fancy East Coast law school, but useless for schools more practical and far away is insulting to me, because I am a graduate of the law school that is farthest away from New York City than any in the country. When I attended, it was tiny, new, and experimental, and it had a curriculum that was put in place by visionaries who weren't there. So this is something you can really only do when there aren't any stakeholders. There were no professors, no students involved. So they said, we are going to require that you take a social science and empirical methods class. You must include social science reading throughout the first year curriculum. Live clinic is required. My entire class was required to spend at least one night in a police cruiser. We read law and economics, we read law and psychiatry, we read jury studies and Brandeis briefs. We read a narrative case study on public health and the asbestos crisis. And this so enraged one of the law students that he vowed to do something about it, and he started the first asbestos practice in the state of Hawaii, made a ton of money, and endowed a chair at my law school in our torts professors' names. This wildly experimental interdisciplinary education made us better lawyers, but more importantly, better citizens. Studying history all the way back to its known's beginning makes the big C for change the master rule. Beautiful civilizations rose and fell in verdant valleys of Mesopotamia, and our own precious and young nation has stumbled mightily more than once. It is falling fast as we watch, but this is not the end. We can look back and see crisis met, crisis surmounted. Somewhere in my hometown, an estate planning lawyer is advising a small business owner on transition. You could monetize your business today, but it's not a great time to sell. Here's what some of my other clients did. Across the ocean, a partner in a blue chip firm is watching the bottom line and going through a list, deciding, making a gut-wrenching decision who to lay off. Contingency planning requires that same partner to have a list for fast-track hiring if things turn around tomorrow. Beating the competition means you have to have that plan to start up again before you know that the recovery is happening for sure. elsewhere, in Washington, D.C., a graduate of an elite 3-year legal education is sitting in a war room discussing the way out of crisis. If his team makes the right choices, finds the right language and political strategy to deploy those choices effectively, the blue chip law firm's contingency hiring plan is going to go in effect tomorrow, and the hometown business owner who decided not to sell made the right choice. History, psychology, economics, politics, immersive understanding of debates over human nature, the just and the good, are required preparation for all of these lawyers as they advise their clients and make decisions about acting wisely under uncertainty. This is a lot to ask out of legal education. But as I see generations of students I have taught going out, deploying those tools, I do feel some pride. I opened this lecture with a scene from history in which civil rights workers were trapped. It's an emotionally stark scene that makes one beg for law. The reality of law's absence in times when it's needed is something we cannot turn away from because we are lawyers. We are the ones to take the phone calls. We are the ones to avert harm through law. We are the ones charged with making law get out of the way when it is stopping human expression, stopping prosperity. You know the command. Sometimes we say, make no law. This is a shorthand. I can speak to you. It's a shorthand about humankind's quest for freedom. And you know it because you are or are soon about to be lawyers. I say with measured pride, that is no small thing. Thank you. That's what I have to say.